The Mafia Boss spoke Arabic. Only the Black Maid answered, silencing all hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Victor Romano stood near the center of the reception hall, a room defined by quiet luxury and careful restraint, where polished marble reflected warm chandelier light, and every conversation sounded measured, practiced, and deliberate. He was a man accustomed to being listened to, not because he raised his voice, but because silence seemed to arrange itself around him. The gathering was private, invitation only, filled with attorneys, business partners, and associates who understood the unspoken rules of proximity and respect. Glassware chimed softly, tailored jackets brushed past one another, and the air carried the faint scent of espresso and expensive cologne. Victor listened more than he spoke, observing how people leaned in when he turned his head, how they paused when his gaze passed over them. Then, without announcement or change in posture, he shifted languages. His words flowed in Arabic, smooth and deliberate, spoken not loudly, but with a calm confidence that suggested intention rather than impulse. The effect was immediate. Conversation stalled. A few smiles froze mid-gesture. Several men who moments earlier had been eager to impress suddenly found interest in their drinks. No one answered him. The language hung in the air like a challenge no one had prepared for, and Victor allowed the quiet to stretch just long enough to reveal who truly understood and who merely pretended to. At the far edge of the room stood Elena Brooks, the maid assigned to circulate quietly with a tray, replenishing glasses before they were empty and disappearing before anyone thought to thank her. She had learned early that invisibility was not a weakness but a skill, one that kept attention away and assumptions firmly in place. Tonight, she wore the same neutral uniform she always did, pressed and simple, blending into the background by design. While the room calculated its response, Elena understood every word. Victor had spoken, not in fragments, not approximately, but completely. She recognized the formal phrasing, the subtle emphasis, even the cultural nuance embedded in the sentence. Her grip tightened slightly on the tray, not from fear, but from awareness. She knew what it meant to speak when no one expected your voice to exist. Around her, the silence deepened. Victor waited, eyes steady, not searching for a specific person, but observing the absence of an answer. This was not a test of fluency alone. It was a measure of courage, of who would step beyond their assigned place. Elena hesitated, aware that the smallest sound could redraw the invisible lines that governed the room. She had spent years learning when to remain quiet, but she had also learned when silence became a kind of agreement. As Victor's gaze moved across the crowd again, Elena took a breath, steady and controlled, and prepared to do the one thing no one else in the room was willing to do. And in that moment, before a single word left her mouth, the balance of the room had already begun to shift. The quiet that followed did not break. It thickened, settling over the room like a held breath no one dared release. Victor Romano remained still, his expression unchanged, allowing the moment to stretch because he understood something most people did not. Discomfort reveals hierarchy faster than confrontation ever could. Around him, men who negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars suddenly found themselves unsure where to place their hands or how long to maintain eye contact. A few offered polite smiles that did not reach their eyes, as if fluency alone might manifest through confidence. Others lowered their gaze entirely, choosing silence over the risk of exposure. This was the world Victor controlled, one built not on noise, but on awareness. To his left, a senior attorney cleared his throat softly, then stopped, realizing there was nothing safe to say. The Arabic phrase Victor had spoken was not obscure, nor was it ceremonial. It was practical, precise, the kind of language used by people who actually conducted business rather than merely studied it. He had chosen it intentionally, knowing exactly who in the room would understand and who would not. The answer he waited for was not mandatory, but the absence of one was informative. At the edge of the gathering, Elena Brooks continued moving with measured steps, her posture straight, her pace unhurried. She refilled a glass, adjusted a napkin, and withdrew without drawing attention, all while the words replayed clearly in her mind. She did not translate them for herself because there was no need. The meaning was immediate, layered, and unmistakable. She also understood why Victor had spoken them here, in this space, among these people. He was reminding them that power was not always announced, and that knowledge did not belong exclusively to those who claimed authority. Elena had spent years observing rooms like this from the margins, learning how people spoke when they believed no one important was listening. She had heard dismissive jokes, careless assumptions, and quiet confidence rooted more in privilege than in competence. What most of them did not know, and had never considered knowing, was that Elena had grown up in a household where multiple languages were spoken without ceremony. Not as an accomplishment, not as a performance, but as a necessity. To her, understanding was not a badge, it was a tool. As Victor's silence continued, a subtle shift passed through the room. The energy changed from anticipation to unease. People glanced at one another, measuring reactions, searching for reassurance that someone else might step in and restore normalcy. No one did. Victor watched all of it, cataloging responses without judgment. His gaze finally moved past the circle of men nearest to him and traveled outward, toward the edges, toward the places people rarely looked. That was when it landed, briefly, on Elena. The look was not sharp or accusatory. It was curious. Elena felt it, not because it lingered, but because it did not. Victor did not stare. He simply noted her presence the way one notes an unexpected detail that does not immediately explain itself. The room remained silent, and in that silence, the hierarchy everyone assumed they understood began to feel less certain. Elena paused near a side table, her tray balanced evenly, her expression calm. She knew the moment was approaching when choice would matter more than caution. Speaking would change how she was seen. Remaining silent would confirm how she was expected to exist. As Victor waited, the distance between those two outcomes narrowed, and Elena understood that what happened next would not be undone. No one moved to fill the silence, and that absence began to feel deliberate rather than accidental. What should have been an easy moment, a polite acknowledgement or a practiced reply, instead exposed the fragile scaffolding beneath the room's confidence. Victor Romano did not repeat himself. He did not soften his tone or translate his words. He simply waited, knowing that repetition would weaken the test. The men closest to him shifted their weight subtly, straightening jackets, adjusting watches, performing small gestures knowing they were being seen, but not knowing what else to do. A banker offered a brief laugh, the kind meant to disguise uncertainty, then stopped when it echoed too loudly in the quiet. Another man nodded as if in agreement with something that had not been said, hoping the gesture alone might be enough. It was not. Victor's expression remained neutral, but the stillness around him carried an unmistakable edge. This was not cruelty, but exposure. Silence, in this case, was not peaceful. It was revealing. Elena Brooks watched the scene unfold with a clarity that surprised even her. She could see how quickly authority dissolved when language removed the illusion of control. These were men used to directing conversations, to defining terms, to deciding when dialogue began and ended. Without that ability, they appeared smaller, less certain, reduced to observers in a moment they no longer commanded. Elena felt the weight of the tray in her hands, familiar and grounding. She had carried heavier things before, responsibilities no one in the room had ever imagined she held. Her mind returned briefly to earlier years, to kitchens filled with overlapping voices, to conversations where switching languages was as natural as breathing. There had been no audience then, no performance, only communication. Here, communication had become a test of worth. Victor allowed a few more seconds to pass, enough for discomfort to sharpen. His eyes moved again, not searching for submission, but scanning for recognition. He knew someone in the room understood him. He had chosen his words too carefully for that not to be true. What interested him now was not who could answer, but who would. The difference mattered. Elena felt the attention in the room shifting, though no one looked directly at her. People sensed that something unresolved lingered, and uncertainty made them uneasy. A senior consultant finally spoke, choosing English, offering a safe, empty remark about timing and logistics. Victor did not respond. The comment faded immediately. dismissed not by rebuttal but by irrelevance. The room learned, in that instant, that avoiding the challenge only deepened it. Elena inhaled slowly, her breath measured. She understood that stepping forward would disrupt the unspoken order that kept her unnoticed and unchallenged. She also understood that remaining silent would confirm every assumption already made about her. The silence was no longer neutral. It pressed, demanding resolution. Victor's gaze returned briefly to her position near the side table, lingering just long enough this time to acknowledge possibility. He did not summon her. He did not invite her. He simply allowed the space for truth to surface if it chose to. Elena set the tray down carefully, the soft clink of glass barely audible yet distinct in the quiet. The sound turned heads, not because it was loud, but because it was unexpected. She straightened, her posture composed, her expression calm. The room watched, uncertain why attention had shifted, unaware that the hierarchy they relied on was about to be challenged not by force, but by understanding. Elena took one measured step forward, knowing that once she spoke, there would be no returning to the safety of invisibility, and in that suspended moment, silence reached its breaking point. Elena paused with her hands resting lightly at her sides, aware that the room was now watching her in a way it never had before. This was the moment she had learned to avoid, the thin edge between being unseen and being remembered. Her thoughts moved quickly, not in panic, but in calculation. She understood the cost of being wrong here, not in dramatic consequences, but in the quieter currency that governs spaces like this: reputation, assumption, permanence. Once a person was placed into a category in a room like this, it rarely changed. Elena had survived by staying exactly where others expected her to be, neither demanding attention nor inviting scrutiny. She had cleaned rooms where decisions were made without her presence acknowledged, and she had listened without appearing to listen, a skill honed over years of practice. Now, that skill felt suddenly insufficient. Victor Romano remained silent, and that silence carried weight. He had not challenged her directly, and that restraint was intentional. He was not testing obedience, but awareness. Elena recognized that distinction clearly. If she spoke, it would not be because she was permitted to, but because she chose to. The room offered no invitation, no encouragement, only expectation shaped by habit. Elena thought briefly of the assumptions layered onto her the moment she entered spaces like this, assumptions about education, background, capability, worth. None of them were based on evidence, yet all of them were powerful. She also thought of the words Victor had spoken, precise and unmistakable, and of how easily they had been understood by her while remaining inaccessible to those who believed themselves superior. The irony was not lost on her. Still, she hesitated, not because she doubted her understanding, but because she understood the structure she was about to disrupt. Speaking would reposition her in the minds of everyone present, including Victor. Silence would preserve the familiar, but at the cost of confirming a lie. Elena's gaze remained forward, steady, her expression composed. She did not look at Victor directly yet. She knew better than to mistake defiance for confidence. This was not about proving anything. It was about truth surfacing where it was least expected. Around her, the room remained suspended, attention sharpened by uncertainty. People sensed a shift without understanding its source. Victor observed her with interest now, not as an authority asserting control, but as someone encountering an anomaly. He recognized hesitation not as weakness, but as awareness of consequence. That recognition mattered. Elena took another breath, grounding herself in the simple reality of the moment. She was not here to challenge anyone. She was here because she understood, and because understanding, when withheld, became a form of complicity. The silence had already spoken volumes. Her voice would simply complete the sentence. Elena finally lifted her eyes, meeting Victor's gaze calmly, without apology or hesitation. In that exchange, something subtle changed. Victor saw not a challenge, but a presence he had misjudged. Elena saw not permission, but space. The room, still unaware of what was coming, waited. Elena opened her mouth, not to perform, not to impress, but to answer. And in that quiet moment before sound emerged, it became clear that what was about to happen would not elevate her above anyone else. It would simply place her where she had always belonged, within the conversation, no longer outside it. Elena spoke before doubt could reclaim the moment, her voice calm and even, carrying just far enough to be heard without demanding attention. She answered Victor in Arabic, not hurried, not hesitant, but precise, her pronunciation clear and measured, the cadence natural rather than rehearsed. The room did not react immediately, as if everyone needed a second to process what had just happened. Elena did not raise her volume or add emphasis. She simply responded, completing the thought Victor had begun, clarifying the intent behind his words rather than merely repeating them. She even adjusted a single phrase, subtly correcting a term he had used, replacing it with one more appropriate for the context, the kind of distinction only someone fluent beyond textbooks would notice. The effect was immediate and absolute. Conversations did not resume. Glasses did not clink. No one moved. Victor's attention fixed on her fully now, not sharply, not defensively, but with unmistakable focus. He understood instantly that her response was not accidental and not borrowed. This was not memorization. This was comprehension. The silence that followed her words was different from the silence before. It was no longer uncomfortable or uncertain. It was stunned. The men who moments earlier had avoided engagement now found themselves excluded entirely, not by design, but by incapacity. They had nothing to add, no entry point into a conversation that had shifted beyond them. Elena stood still, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. She did not look around to measure reactions. She did not seek approval. Her role had not changed in her own mind. She had answered a question. That was all. Victor regarded her for a long moment, assessing not just what she had said, but how she had said it. There was no triumph in her tone, no satisfaction at being the only one who could respond. If anything, her manner suggested restraint, an understanding that knowledge carried responsibility as much as power. Victor recognized that restraint immediately. It was familiar to him, though rarely encountered. He replied to her, again in Arabic, this time directing his words solely toward her, asking a follow-up that deepened the exchange rather than concluding it. Elena answered again without pause, maintaining the same calm precision, meeting his words exactly where they landed. With each exchange, the room fell further away, observers to a dialogue they could neither interrupt nor interpret. Some shifted uncomfortably, others watched with expressions caught between disbelief and recalculation. Hierarchies they relied on no longer applied. The conversation no longer belonged to those with titles or status, but to those who understood. Victor's expression changed subtly, not into a smile, but into something more revealing, recognition. He did not acknowledge the room. He did not offer explanation. He simply continued speaking to Elena, allowing the truth of the moment to stand on its own. Elena responded once more, then fell silent, signaling completion rather than retreat. The quiet that followed was total. Victor inclined his head slightly, not in deference, but in acknowledgement. Nothing more was required. Elena stepped back to where she had stood before, her movements unhurried, her presence returning to the periphery by choice rather than force. The room remained still, everyone aware that something irreversible had occurred. Power had not been seized or displayed. It had been exposed, redefined, and quietly redistributed, leaving behind a silence no one knew how to break. The room did not recover after Elena stepped back, and the stillness that followed her retreat carried a new weight, one that could not be mistaken for politeness. People shifted not because they wished to speak, but because they no longer knew how to behave. The familiar rhythm of the gathering had broken, replaced by an awareness that something fundamental had been revealed. Victor Romano remained where he was, his posture unchanged, but his attention no longer dispersed evenly across the room. It stayed where Elena had stood, as if the space itself had retained significance. He understood that moments like this could not be recreated on command. They appeared briefly, altered the balance, and disappeared, leaving consequences in their wake. Around him, men recalculated quietly. Some avoided his gaze, uncertain whether their silence moments earlier had been noticed or forgiven. Others attempted to regain footing through small talk, murmured comments that faded as soon as they were spoken. No one addressed Elena directly. Doing so would require acknowledging what had just happened, and acknowledgement carried risk. Elena resumed her work with deliberate normalcy, lifting the tray again, adjusting her pace to match the quiet tension that now defined the room. She did not hurry, nor did she linger. Her movements were precise, familiar, grounded in routine. Inside, however, she was acutely aware of the shift. Eyes followed her now, some curious, some unsettled, all more attentive than before. She did not meet them. Attention, once earned, was a responsibility she did not intend to misuse. Victor watched the reactions unfold with interest rather than satisfaction. He had not orchestrated humiliation, nor had he intended to elevate anyone publicly. What mattered to him was clarity. He had gained it. He now knew which of the people surrounding him relied on borrowed confidence and which possessed genuine understanding. He also knew that knowledge could exist far from where power expected to find it. That realization stayed with him, quiet but persistent. A man near the windows attempted to re-establish conversation by commenting on logistics for the evening. Victor responded briefly, then let the exchange end. His focus had shifted permanently. When his gaze returned to Elena, it was not with suspicion or demand, but with evaluation stripped of assumption. He saw someone who had not sought recognition, yet had accepted it without hesitation. That combination was rare. Elena felt the room settle into an uneasy equilibrium, a new arrangement forming without discussion. She understood that while her position had not officially changed, perception had. That change could not be reversed, only managed. She remained composed, anchoring herself in the discipline that had brought her this far. The silence that followed was not broken by applause or commentary. It dissolved gradually, replaced by subdued movement and cautious speech, but something essential had shifted beneath the surface. The gathering would continue, but it would not return to what it had been moments earlier. Victor took a final look around the room, then spoke again, this time in English, his tone neutral, his words brief. The meeting moved forward, but the authority behind it had been recalibrated. Elena passed near him once more, close enough to be acknowledged without spectacle. Victor inclined his head slightly as she moved by, not as a gesture of superiority or familiarity, but as confirmation that he had seen her, truly seen her. Elena continued on without pause, her expression unchanged. The room absorbed the gesture in silence, understanding without explanation that something had ended and something else had begun, quietly, irrevocably, and without the need for another word. As the gathering continued under its newly tempered rhythm, Victor Romano found that his attention no longer rested on the agenda that had brought everyone together. Numbers were discussed, timelines mentioned, agreements implied, yet his focus drifted repeatedly to a quieter calculation. He had spent his life reading rooms, identifying leverage, and predicting outcomes before others realized there was a game being played. Tonight had offered him something rarer than advantage. It had offered him correction. He realized that while authority had always answered to him, understanding had not. That distinction settled in his mind with unexpected clarity. Elena Brooks moved through the space with the same composure she always carried, but Victor now noticed details he had previously overlooked. The steadiness of her pace, the economy of her movements, the way she navigated the room without disruption or hesitation. Nothing about her suggested the need to be seen, and yet she had been unmistakable the moment she chose to speak. That balance intrigued him. When a brief pause opened in the conversation, Victor addressed her directly for the first time, his tone even, his words measured, asking a practical question related to the earlier exchange. He did not raise his voice or announce her presence. He simply spoke as though it were natural that she should be included. Elena stopped and turned toward him, meeting his gaze without uncertainty. She answered concisely, again demonstrating understanding without embellishment. The men nearby listened in silence, aware that the conversation had shifted beyond their reach. Victor followed with another question, slightly more complex, framed to test depth rather than surface knowledge. Elena responded again, her words precise, her tone respectful but unafraid. Each exchange reinforced what Victor had already begun to accept. The hierarchy he had assumed was incomplete. Knowledge had not aligned itself with status, and he had nearly missed it. He observed how others reacted, how shoulders tightened, how expressions flattened. They were not being dismissed explicitly, yet exclusion settled around them unmistakably. Victor did not apologize for it. He did not explain. He understood that justification would cheapen the truth of the moment. Elena, for her part, did not linger. When the exchange concluded, she stepped away naturally, returning to her responsibilities without expectation. That choice mattered more to Victor than any display of confidence. It signaled that she did not measure her worth by the attention of the room. She knew where she stood regardless of who acknowledged it. As the evening drew closer to its end, Victor noticed that the tone of the gathering had changed permanently. Conversations were quieter, more cautious. People spoke with greater care, aware that assumptions could no longer be trusted. He recognized that this recalibration would follow him beyond the room, influencing decisions yet to be made. Elena passed by once more, and this time Victor addressed her briefly, offering a simple acknowledgement, neither praise nor command. She accepted it with a nod and continued on, leaving him with the understanding that respect did not require spectacle to be genuine. In that moment, Victor recognized that power, when confronted with truth, could either harden or evolve. He chose the latter, not as an act of charity, but as a correction long overdue. The room would remember the silence that had fallen earlier, but Victor would remember something else entirely. The realization that authority was not diminished by recognizing value where it had been ignored, and that true control began with the willingness to listen. The gathering began to thin as conversations concluded and departures were quietly arranged. Yet the shift Elena had initiated did not fade with the crowd. It lingered in the way people spoke more carefully, in the pauses that preceded their words, in the awareness that assumptions were no longer safe. Victor Romano observed this with measured interest, understanding that influence was often most effective when it altered behavior without announcing itself. He did not call attention to what had happened, nor did he allow others to reinterpret it into something smaller. Instead, he continued the evening with deliberate calm, guiding discussions toward closure while quietly redefining who mattered within them. When a final exchange required clarification, Victor did not address the senior advisors closest to him. He turned instead to Elena, his voice level, his choice intentional, and asked a question that required both linguistic precision and contextual judgment. It was not a test disguised as courtesy. It was a decision. Elena paused, turned, and answered with the same clarity she had shown before, offering insight that resolved the matter efficiently and without embellishment. Victor accepted her response immediately, nodding once, signaling completion. No further debate followed. The room understood the message without explanation. Authority had chosen competence, and competence had delivered. Elena returned to her tasks, unassuming and steady, yet the atmosphere around her had transformed. She was no longer invisible, but neither was she elevated beyond herself. That balance was the quiet justice of the moment. No reprimands were issued, no public corrections made. Those who had assumed superiority were left with nothing but reflection. Victor recognized that this outcome was more effective than any display of dominance. It required no force, no confrontation, only the clear alignment of decision with truth. As the final guests prepared to leave, Victor addressed the group briefly, thanking them for their time and signaling the end of the evening. His words were concise, neutral, leaving no room for reinterpretation. People departed with subdued expressions, each carrying their own understanding of what had occurred. Elena collected glasses and straightened surfaces, restoring the room to its original order, though she knew it would never be quite the same again. Victor watched her once more, aware that the correction he had experienced would continue to influence his judgment beyond this night. He understood now that leadership was not diminished by recognizing overlooked value. It was strengthened by it. When Elena passed him for the last time, Victor spoke quietly, not to command, not to commend publicly, but to acknowledge her contribution with simple respect. She inclined her head slightly, accepting the recognition without expectation. That exchange, understated and sincere, carried more weight than any announcement could have. As the doors closed and the room emptied, silence returned, but it was no longer uncomfortable or uncertain. It was settled, the kind of silence that follows resolution rather than tension. Elena finished her work and prepared to leave, her role unchanged in title but transformed in truth. Victor remained for a moment longer, standing alone in the space, reflecting not on control, but on correction. He understood that justice did not always arrive loudly or dramatically. Sometimes, it entered quietly, took its place without permission, and left behind a room that could never again pretend it had not been there. When the night finally released its hold on the building, the silence that remained felt earned rather than imposed. Elena Brooks stepped into the corridor outside the reception hall, the soft echo of her footsteps marking the end of an evening that had altered more than anyone would openly admit. She did not carry the moment with pride or resentment. She carried it with clarity. What had happened belonged to the room as much as it belonged to her, and she understood that true shifts rarely announce themselves. Victor Romano remained inside a few minutes longer, standing where the conversations had begun and ended, aware that authority, once questioned by truth, could never return to its previous shape. He did not regret that change. In fact, he welcomed it. The correction had been necessary, long overdue, and delivered without spectacle. As Elena collected her belongings and prepared to leave, no one stopped her, no one offered congratulations or questions. That absence was itself a form of respect. She exited the building as she always did, unnoticed by passers-by, her presence blending into the city's steady rhythm. Yet something fundamental had shifted within her understanding of space and voice. She knew now, without doubt, that her place in any room was not determined by invitation, but by truth. Inside, Victor concluded the evening with quiet finality, turning off lights, closing doors, restoring order to a space that had briefly revealed its hidden structure. He understood that those who had witnessed the exchange would carry it forward in subtle ways, adjusting their assumptions, reconsidering their certainty. No reprimands would be necessary. The silence itself had done the work. In the days that followed, decisions would be made differently, conversations approached with greater care. Not because fear had been introduced, but because awareness had. Victor recognized that leadership was not weakened by acknowledging intelligence where it had been ignored. It was strengthened by it. Elena continued her routine in the days that followed, her work unchanged in form, but elevated in meaning. She did not seek advancement or recognition. She did not need it. What mattered had already occurred. She had spoken when silence would have been easier, and in doing so, she had reclaimed something that could not be taken away. Victor, for his part, carried the lesson quietly, allowing it to influence his judgment without announcement. He listened more carefully, asked better questions, and paid closer attention to the edges of the room. He knew now that power revealed itself most honestly not in who spoke the loudest, but in who understood the most. The world resumed its pace, indifferent to the shift that had taken place within those walls, yet changed all the same. Elena walked through her days with steady purpose, her dignity intact, her voice secure in the knowledge that it did not require permission. Victor moved forward with a recalibrated sense of authority, aware that respect, once earned through humility, had a way of returning stronger than before. And that night, though never spoken of again, remained quietly present in their understanding, a reminder that the truest form of justice often arrives without force, without applause, and without warning, leaving behind only clarity and the unmistakable weight of silence.